Welcome to an episode of Behind the Scenes, a weekly program unveiling the biggest political developments in Somali politics and the wider Horn of Africa region. I'm Sultan Mohammed, your host and co-producer here on Horford Media, alongside Suleiman Hashi. On this week's program, for the first time, the 5,000-strong Somali force training in Eritrea was showcased to the world as President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud visited Asmara on an official 4-day working trip. This comes after fake news was peddled and circulated in the Somali political arena over the past year, suggesting that the Somali National Army units based in Eritrea fought and died in the Tigray War. Now, how and why was there fake news about the Somali soldiers based in Eritrea, and where are they now? These are the topics on the program today. We hope you find this program very informative. Please like, share, and for similar content, do subscribe to Horford Media. Also, do subscribe to Horford Media Group's second channel, which you are currently watching, known as Horford TV, where you can find exclusive programs such as Behind the Scenes, the African Weekly Roundup, and Mahahisra, among others. And last but not least, do follow myself, Sultan Mohammed, Suleiman Hashi, Yasin Abdi, and the wider Horford Media team on our social media platforms that should appear on the screen any moment. Let's get straight into it. Now, in a statement that surprised many, Villa Somalia announced that President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud planned to travel to Eritrea on an official 4-day trip in which he would meet Somali National Army soldiers that were training in the country. For over a year now, many Somali politicians that were opposed to the former government led by former President Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo, including the current incumbent president, argued that the Somali unit stationed in Eritrea took part in the conflict in neighboring Tigray region of Ethiopia. From major presidential candidates to political analysts, journalists to so-called independent think tanks, they all unanimously agreed that there must have been Somali soldiers that fought in the Tigray War because the Tigrayan leadership argued so. Now, in hindsight, what we can see is a sophisticated and coordinated disinformation campaign. By a handful of interconnected individuals from various professions that had vested interests in Somalia. It is such individuals that planted the seed that would eventually form to be one of the biggest fake news scandals that would hit the Somali government in over a decade. Now, before we actually assess the most recent updates regarding the Somali National Armies stationed in Eritrea, let's take a trip down memory lane to see exactly who and when this seed of disinformation was planted within the Somali political arena. Now, many supporters of this argument that Somali troops did fight in Tigray cite the UN Human Rights Council, more specifically the report released by the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Eritrea, Mohammed Abdulsalam Babikar. Now, halfway down page 6 of this report, the following is written. The Special Rapporteur also received information reports that the Somali soldiers were moved from military training camps in Eritrea to the front line in Tigray, where they accompanied Eritrean troops as they crossed the Ethiopian border. It is also reported that Somali fighters were present around Aksum. The government of Somalia denied the participation of Somali soldiers in the Tigray conflict. Now, of course, such a statement is bold as there is no actual evidence produced by Mr. Babikar other than he had received information that Somali troops were fighting in Tigray. So the question becomes, where did the Special Rapporteur obtain this information? If we actually look at the citation for the paragraph, we see that the exact source of this information comes from a controversial and unsubstantiated article written by a journalist named Amanda Spieber for the South African newspaper The Mail and the Guardian, titled "Somali Troops May Have Been Drawn into the Ethiopian Civil War," that was dated 20th of January 2021. In her article, Ms. Spieber argues that the Somali soldiers accompanied Eritrean troops to fight in Tigray, leaving their designated army barracks in Eritrea. She cites the controversial newspaper Garowe Online as being the direct source of information to back up such a statement. And Garowe Online previously interviewed former NISA Chief Abdulsalam Guled. Mr. Guled previously served as the director of the Somali National Intelligence and Security Agency between 2013 and 2017. Now, Guled told Garowe Online the Somali soldiers left their barracks and joined the war against the TPLF in the Tigray region alongside the Ethiopian army. However, what is interesting is that within the same article, Ms. Spieber warns readers that Garowe Online itself couldn't verify the accusations and the statements made by the former NISA chief Abdulsalam Guled, who they were interviewing. In fact, when Ms. Spieber interviewed Guled on behalf of the Mail and Guardian newspaper, Mr. Guled stated that his source of information was an unnamed Ethiopian official and an anonymous civilian woman that he claimed saw Somali fighters present around the ancient city of Aksum. However, of course, such sources lack any credibility and validity. especially when claims are of this magnitude. For instance, the Ethiopian Defense Force has Somalis within its ranks. Additionally, the Somali regional state in Ethiopia also deployed state troops to fight against the TPLF in Tigray. Therefore, in a situation where witnesses were credible, if they were, hypothetically speaking, those Somalis she could have seen could easily have been Somali Ethiopians that were fighting for Ethiopia. And now Ms. Bieber concluded her inadequately researched article by again referencing another anonymous individual. This time, an unnamed Somali man told her that his brother joined the Somali National Army in November 2019 before allegedly, and I quote, disappearing in March 2020. Now pay close attention to the word disappeared as a description of the whereabouts of these Somali soldiers. The word disappears automatically implies sinister intentions and actions by the federal government against the newly recruited Somali soldiers. While the word disappeared in this article is not an outright bold accusation, it buries the seeds for analysts and others to use this as a source of information to push a narrative built on false sources or unverified information. In actuality, militaries across the world deploy soldiers for training or combat missions across the globe in absolute secrecy. Take the US for example. US soldiers cannot inform their family members about certain locations and missions, yet many analysts and journalists, particularly Western, convey the picture in Somalia that the government must be evil if it is not conveying with the public sensitive state information that could be detrimental to national security if it were publicly announced, for instance. Like, for example, the position and the training of Somali soldiers in Eritrea could be a national security risk if it were to be exposed to the entire globe, including Somali's enemies and terrorists where they're positioned. So the burning question becomes, why are journalists and analysts that work for reputable or known organizations using these unverified statements and accusations in their articles? In fact, the bigger question becomes, why did the UN Special Rapporteur Mohammed Abdulsalam Babikar use these unverified sources in his report as credible information to report back to the UN Human Rights Council? You have to understand that Somalia is currently in an uphill battle to remove Chapter 7 powers that have been imposed on Somalia since the beginning of the Somali Civil War. For those that do not know, Chapter 7 of the UN Charter includes various articles that set out powers for the UN Security Council, but in simple terms, it enables the UN Security Council, and I quote, to determine the existence of any threat to peace, breach of the peace, or act of aggression, and essentially allows them to deploy armies or impose certain embargoes or sanctions. And for example, Somalia is currently under a UN arms embargo, which has been fighting for the last 5 years. The reality is that many states seem to be completely opposed to the idea of a strong Somali National Army. Now, in a report we released here on Hot for the Media in 2020, we found that a proposition was put forth before former President Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo during the Somali conference in London to cap the Somali National Army at only 18,000 soldiers, to which he refused to sign, according to sources close to Villa Somalia at that time. Now, just to give you context of how small that is, the Metropolitan Police Force, which is the police force in the UK which is in charge of policing the Greater London area, has over 33,000 officers. Now, if you compare that to a country in a state of war against a sophisticated, internationally connected terrorist organization, 18,000 soldiers is far less than an adequate number of soldiers. In fact, the African Union mission in Somalia has over 22,000 soldiers, roughly estimated, and they've been unable to remove Al-Shabaab for the last over 10 years. So what makes these all countries assume that 18,000 Somali soldiers will do anything against Al-Shabaab if 22,000 African Union soldiers are struggling to do so at the moment? Now, many attempts have been made to substantiate these fake allegations. Many of you probably remember in June 2021, 5 men randomly appeared in Getaway claiming to be Somali soldiers that escaped training in Eritrea. Now, in an interview with regional media, the 5 men claimed that they deserted the camps due to, and I quote, tough training and a lack of medical care. However, despite giving false names and false information, all those that were interviewed clarified that they did not participate in any conflict in the Tigray War. Whether these individuals were actually members of the Somali National Army cannot be verified by behind the scenes or for the media, because the Somali Defense Ministry did not address any of the statements made by these alleged soldiers. So, back to the burning question, why did the UN Special Rapporteur Mohammed Abdulsalam Babikar use these unverified sources in his report as credible information to report back to the UN Human Rights Council? We may actually never know the answer to this question, but it does seem as though Mr. Babikar has fell well below the standards required of him in terms of research, as the peddling of disinformation and inaccurate facts is a very dangerous activity on social media, an arena plagued by fake news, particularly in Somalia. So, back to now, where are the soldiers? Now, in a statement by both Villa Somalia and the Eritrean Information Ministry, it outlined that the president Hassan Sheikh Mahmoud visited Somali soldiers that received 3-year training. Now, the president inspected a parade of the members of the National Army. Representatives of trainees paid tribute to a rigorous program of training and lessons, according to the Ministry of Information in Eritrea. Now, sources have confirmed that some of those soldiers will be forming part of a special commandos unit, as well as some that specialize in urban combat, for example, and others that specialize in rural combat. Now, the president also visited Somali Naval Forces training in the port city of Massawa. President Hassan Sheikh met and inspected military parade of speedboats of members of the Somali National Army, again according to the Ministry of Information in Eritrea. Now, in his message to naval trainees, President Hassan Sheikh expressed his confidence in them. Now, ultimately, what can we conclude from all of this? There's 2 things that I want to conclude for you. 1. Somali soldiers in Eritrea didn't participate in any conflict in the Tigray region. Reports released by some newspapers all the way to the UN reports sourced unverified and unsubstantiated information from unknown and unnamed individuals, and there's literally no evidence. And on top of all of this, there's video footage now. There's actual video footage. The president has been there, the soldiers are there, no one's dead, nobody's missing. Well, dead as a result of the Tigray war. Secondly, President Hassan Sheikh Mahmoud seems to be surprisingly more committed than ever before to continue the work of the previous government, to work on the Somali National Army. He initially visited the Ministry of Defense in June before traveling to Turkey to meet Somali soldiers in Sparta, before visiting Somali soldiers in Eritrea this week. Now, despite statements made in opposition, it seems as though Hassan Sheikh is following the trajectory he claimed he would be on in preparing Somalia for the final push to eradicate Al-Shabaab from our lands.